Hello everyone. It's autumn here in New Zealand and my sketchbook is filling up with all sorts of colourful goodness. Of course, the autumn story would not be complete without including one of the best things about autumn, mushrooms. Let's get started. Working from some photos I've taken, I do a light pencil sketch. I work from multiple photos, picking different mushrooms to make a pleasing composition. This is the advantage of painting over photography. You get to put things wherever you like. Using masking fluid, I mask out the white spots on the mushrooms and then I wait for that to completely dry. And now it's time for some colour. I look very carefully at each mushroom. They're not just red, they have all sorts of different shades. Red, pink, orange, purple, yellow. If you want your mushroom to look lifelike, you need to include all those different shades. On my palette, I've mixed all those different shades, and you'll see as I start painting that I change colors subtly. Here I've changed from a red to a more pinkish red, and I also sometimes make the color much lighter. I'm continually glancing back at my photograph and really looking at the colors. Here I'm using a much more orange red, and you'll see I drop in some purple for that shadowy area. In order to get one color to softly bleed into the next, you need to work with very watery paint and just the softest touch of the brush to the paper. Notice here, where I add the yellow, I drag in the red to create a soft edge. Because my paint is very wet, the red hasn't dried, and that's what makes this possible. I clean my brush and dry it on a paper towel, and then using that damp brush, I drag in some soft highlights. Again, I'm looking really closely at my photograph to see where those are. I decide that the left side of the mushroom needs to be much darker, so I mix up a thicker red paint and I drop that in. The sketchbook that I'm using is made by Etchr and it has 100% cotton paper. That means that I have a lot of time for working because the paper doesn't dry very fast. I'm also working on a very cool day, which helps a lot as well. Now's the time when I want this mushroom to dry just a little bit to get to the damp phase. so that the next layers that I add will make slightly sharper edges. So I leave this mushroom now and I start working on one of the other ones. The tops of the other mushrooms I work in exactly the same way, dropping in the different colors, looking very closely at the photographs. Because I'm working from multiple photographs, I have to be very careful that my painting makes sense. I concentrate on having all the light coming from the same side, and so that the shadows in this case will all be on the left, and sometimes I touch up colors to make sure that everything makes sense as well. When the mushroom caps are dry, I start to work on the stalks. I wet the stalk and I drop in some shadow colors. I don't want the shadow to be entirely grey because the mushroom caps cast color onto the stalks below, so there will be reds and yellows and purples in those shadows. The stalks are white, so any reflected colors you add in, the reds and the yellows and the purples, need to be very light. So make sure that you use a watery mix of paint. Lots of water, very little paint. Here, with a clean damp brush, I'm using that same technique I used on the mushroom tops to create a highlight on the right hand side of the stalk. We want the stalks to look rounded and 3D. While the stalk is still wet, I drop in some darker shadows under the mushroom cap. I'm still looking at the reflected color, so this won't just be a solid grey. Notice how I'm still using very light color. If you go too dark too fast, you get yourself into trouble that you can't get out of later. The mushroom stalks are white. Even though we're adding a lot of color, we want them still to look like they are white. I'm going to let this stalk dry now and work on the other ones. The mushroom at the back we can see the underside of, and so using the same technique I used just for the stalks, I add in the color there. Touch more yellow because the underside of the mushrooms is yellow. Now it's time for the forest floor. I mix up a range of dark browns, red browns and golden colors that will represent the leaves on the floor. I drop in these colors randomly, just dancing my brush across the page. Okay, it's not exactly random. I am concentrating again on where the shadow lies, so on the left sides of the mushrooms I drop in slightly darker colors. The forest floor is rough, it's full of dead leaves and twigs. So if I dance my brush across the page, varying my strokes and leaving lots of white patches, I can create a sense of roughness without painting every single leaf. This part is great fun, so don't overthink it. Drop in all sorts of colors, greens, blues, golds, browns. It doesn't really matter. The forest floor is full of lots of colors. I leave the forest floor to dry and I go back to the stalks, and with a tiny brush I darken some of the shadows. I use a damp brush and I touch the edges of the shadows to give them a soft edge. And to keep the shadows interesting, I drop in some of those reflected colours we spoke about before. A touch of pink, a touch of purple, a touch of yellow. Then I do the same thing on the other stalks. Now it's time for the tiniest brush that I own to add in all the tiny details. I don't paint every single gill, every single mark, every single line, just enough to give a suggestion that they are all there. Now that the ground is dry, I can go back and strengthen some of the shadows, and then using lots of paint and lots of water, I add some splatters to the background. You don't have to do this, but I think it adds a sense of sparkle and life to your painting. It's time to let the painting completely dry before I remove the masking fluid, so I work on the mushroom on the opposite page of my sketchbook. When it's completely dry, I use an eraser and I rub off the masking fluid, revealing lovely white spots. And then it's back to that teeny tiny brush to add some shading to the white spots, because they do really stand out quite a lot from the mushroom. All these tiny details do make a difference, so don't rush this. If you need to take a break, do that. Have a cup of tea. Come back the next day if you have to. Now, using my fountain pen with some brown ink, I concentrate on some of the shadow areas and put in the tiniest of marks. Go easy with the pen. We don't want the marks to be too obvious. It's almost like if someone looked at your sketch, they wouldn't be able to tell that you'd used any ink. We're just bringing our sketch into focus. With the white marker, I add a touch of sparkle and some life to the sketch, and we're done. Thanks everyone for following along. If you have any questions, please pop them in the comments below. And if you do paint a mushroom, I would love to see it, so do send them to me. Ciao!